Then I'm very happy to introduce Laura here this evening with her presentation, Alpine Ecosystems on the Edge. And she's going to be talking about the climate change and the effects of climate change in the Stubai Alps. I've had the pleasure of introducing Laura to ski touring in this winter season, and I've very much enjoyed spending time with her and the other participants. We've had a great course, and she told me about the PhD that she is working on at that time, or at this time, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from her. Without further ado, Laura, I would like to pass on the word to you.
Okay, hello everyone, and thanks Jeff for introducing me. So my name is Laura, and I'm originally from Scotland, but I'm living and studying here in Austria now, and I'm doing my PhD at the University of Innsbruck in the Department of Ecology. And yeah, as Jeff said, I did a ski touring course back in February, and I spoke about climate change in mountain areas just about the whole time, and I think Jeff just wanted me to be quiet. Like, do come do this talk with us later. No, it's really interesting as well to speak to people who spend a lot of time in the mountains, because they are witnessing climate change really up close in certain places, and often have really interesting observations. And I imagine all of you as well will have your own observations of climate change in the mountains, no matter how long it is that you have been witnessing a certain place in time. So yeah, my study site is in the Stubai Alps, so I'll be using that as an example as I go through of how climate change is impacting mountain areas, though every valley is a little bit unique. And it's one of the things that makes it quite difficult to study climate change across large areas. Think about north and south facing sides of a valley and how different those can be in terms of conditions and snow. Yeah, we do a lot of work at the University of Innsbruck on how climate change is driving impacts in the Alps. So if there's anything particularly that catches your eye today that you think is really interesting, I'm happy to share some links and some papers. Yeah, you can ask me at the end. Okay, so I am hoping this is going to work. So climate change is, I hope you've all heard of climate change by now. If not, I don't know where you've been, but climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is being caused by human emissions to the atmosphere and reduction in places where we can store the kind of carbon that we're emitting. Things like forests, peatlands, grasslands, and climate change kind of works in the alpine environment in three ways. We have increasing temperature, and this is increasing average temperature. So again, thinking about heterogeneity within mountain landscapes. Some places are much colder than others, some places get much more sun. And it's again this kind of idea that the Alps are very varied even within a single landscape. So we know that the warming in the Alps is about twice as fast as the global average. So that makes the Alps a really great place to study climate change, but also quite a scary place to study climate change. And alongside temperature increase, we also have these shifting patterns of precipitation. And that just means where and how water is falling from the sky, whether it's falling as snow, whether it's falling as water, is it falling in the summer or the spring or the winter or the autumn. And these patterns are quite murky, but we are seeing increasing frequency and intensity of summer droughts, as well as less snowfall in the winter, which I'm sure a lot of you already have noticed and experienced. And then finally, we have this increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. So these can be things like droughts, flooding, landslides, but also these extremely hot days, the extreme heat days. And not just one-off heat days, but days occurring in a row where each day is the hottest day on record. I think these are the kinds of headlines we see in the news, and they're quite powerful, and they for sure stick in our minds, and they really impact our experiences here in the mountains. So, as I said before, mountains are highly varied environments, and what we find at the bottom of the mountain is really different from what we find at the top. So to kind of go through this, I thought I would split it into 4 rough zones. This is not a hard and fast model, it's a massive generalization. Not all mountain landscapes have these 4 features, and very rarely are they delineated this nicely and clearly. But I thought it would be a nice way to sort of pull a line through how we see change occurring in the mountains. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about change in forests. So I study mountain forests mainly. I'm in a project called Future Mountain Forests at the University of Innsbruck. So this is definitely the area I can answer the most questions on. But what we are finding generally is that forests are becoming more and more dense, and they are expanding up the mountainsides. However, we think this is not only due to climate change. We know that land management and the way people are managing the forest is also playing a large role here, and this is changing a lot. But in the future, we can expect to see trees and forests higher up the mountainsides interroll, and especially in the Stubai Alps, we see a lot of a species called Norway spruce. You can see it in this photo here. It's a very classic alpine species, but generally has been farmed as monocultures in mountain areas because it's a great timber species, but it's not very resistant to climate change is what we're finding. And as climate change progresses, we're expecting to see a shift in the kinds of species we find in forests, so much more broadleaf species, which are a bit more resilient to climate change. And as well, linked to this Norway spruce is the idea of disturbance events. So I want to talk a little bit about a storm that you have probably heard about. Storm Vaya hit Tyrol in 2018, I believe, before I arrived, but I do remember it being in the headlines. So here are a few photos showing the kinds of damage. You can see above this village that large parts of the forest have been destroyed. And that's a big deal because now in the winter, these villages are more at risk of avalanches and also rockfall, or just any kind of material that is going to fall down the mountain. But what was especially bad about Storm Vaya was that just after they had explosion in the bark beetle population, which you can see in this photo at the bottom. And bark beetle is this insect. It's part of the natural system here in the Alps. But when you have lots of dead wood lying around, the population explodes and essentially can kill large portions of the healthy forest. So in a very short period of time, Storm Vaya caused about 5 billion worth of damage, I believe. And yes, 5 billion euros worth of damage, but also killed 37 people. This was a big, dangerous storm. And as we're looking to the future and we're thinking more about storms and extreme events, we can kind of expect to see more things like this. So I want to move on now to grassland and shrub zones. This is something that other people in my lab group study. And when we're thinking about grasslands and shrub zones, these are kind of maybe slightly more subtle changes. We don't notice them in a big way. We notice like a big forest falling down. But what we are finding in the grassland zone is that the trees are moving upwards into it. And so this zone is kind of being invaded. And in the Stubai and much of the rest of the Alps, a lot of that land was managed in a traditional small holding farm style. called the Alm. But today, very few of this kind of way of managing the land still exists. And this is meaning that the trees and the shrubs are kind of encroaching on this land, and this is leading to loss of alpine meadows and loss of biodiversity of plants and insects. And that's a very difficult issue to tackle. But they're also being exposed to drought and temperature extremes, which is also not good for these areas. And I wanted to show some photos from a project led by a professor in our department, Eric Tasser, and some pictures of Neustift in Stubai Tal, which some of you might recognize. So we have here 1907 and 2008, so just over 100 years apart, and we can see how much the tree line has expanded into this meadow area, and also that the forest has become much, much denser. There's also much more trees around the bottom of the valley, and also the settlement is much bigger. So the Stubai Tal is just one valley in the Alps, but this kind of mirrors a trend that's happening all over the Alps at the moment. And hopefully this moves on. And here's another photo, kind of similar, taken slightly later in 1925, and again in 2008. But we can see that these higher up areas, there are more trees growing here. And people ask sometimes, like, oh, is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's kind of neither. These sorts of changes are quite hard to really understand. It's because more trees means more carbon sequestration in that specific area, but it also means loss of a type of biodiversity. And we don't really know what the impacts of that are yet. So we'll talk a little bit now about the tundra zone. So this is a really important habitat for freshwater regulation, but also biodiversity. This area is covered by extensive snow cover throughout many, many months of the year. But we think under a moderate warming scenario of about 1.5 degrees increase in temperature, of global average temperature, we could lose about half of alpine tundra habitat. And this is a big deal concerning water regulation and also carbon sequestration and also biodiversity. So although this might seem like a harsh environment for plants, the snow actually helps to insulate plants throughout the winter, keeping the roots from being frozen. Think about wearing a big puffer jacket. The snow acts like a big insulation layer and stops the roots under the soil freezing. So even though these plants are exposed to extreme low temperatures, the snow helps to keep them warm. So when that snow isn't there and rain falls into the soil and freezes, the plants are actually exposed to much lower temperatures. So these kinds of effects can damage this environment, and especially because the species here tend to be quite slow growing, and there's high sensitivity to change in this habitat. So there's also a habitat that's quite popular amongst tourists, especially when we think about gondolas, mountain uplift, and it causes these extremely high concentration areas of tourism where we have lots of erosion, we have lots of footfall, litter, waste, and these kinds of ways that we interact with these very specific areas and the very sensitive environment alongside the effects of climate change is really important. And I think now we kind of move on to perhaps what is the most iconic sort of part of the Alps and the Alpine zone. And this is probably where you notice the effects of climate change the most. because we're talking about things like glacier retreat, snow melt. For example, the Stubai Glacier, which you find at the top of the Stubai Valley, has lost about 33% of its mass since 1969. And in 2003 was the first year when the bottom of the glacier, the end of it, was covered in a plastic sheet to reduce a type of melting called ablation, where essentially the bottom of the glacier melts and calves off and it pulls down the rest of the glacier, speeding up melt. These plastic sheets now cover about 400,000 square meters of the glacier from May until the start of the winter season, when the snow's falling again and the ski season starts. So yeah, why do we do this? It's to extend the ski season in this part of the Alps. But additionally, at the same time, we know that the ski seasons are becoming shorter with much less predictability in the conditions. And this is all driving impacts as well within the social realm of places like the Stubai, which are now reliant on this important winter tourism. So in addition to these kinds of like winter sport related changes and winter industry related changes, we see loss of ice and permafrost throughout the year, which is making the alpine environment less stable. So we're also seeing much more rockfall in quite a few areas. This isn't universal. The Alps are very heterogeneous in their nature, so it also depends on the kind of rock you have underneath your ice. But if permafrost is holding a mountain together, that is a dangerous mountain to be on. You might have seen in the news over the last few days that a village in Switzerland had to be evacuated because there was rockfall off a mountain and they were worried about collapse of the whole peak. And the peak was called Nesthorn. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So instability is a constant in mountain areas. It's something that we've always known, but now these big rockfall events, these collapses of mountainsides are becoming more and more common, and we're seeing them in more times of the year as well, importantly. So we're kind of seeing a lot of these patterns across the different areas in the mountain, these shifting precipitation patterns, snow cover and loss, loss of permanent snow patches, and rockfall and avalanche protection being lost. But again, we see those most strongly within this alpine zone. And I do have a picture from, this is the Dresdner Hütte, which is up at this top of the Stubai Valley. And this is a very typical kind of photo. We see lots of these sorts of photos now, especially in the media, I think. And again, this first photo was taken in 1920, the next one in 2008. We can see how much the glacier has retreated, but also the increase in the infrastructure, the human infrastructure here. The Hütte is much larger, and there is many more tracks, and even a crane up here. So at the same time as these environments are becoming more damaged and fragile, we are also using them more. And I think that is definitely something we should be thinking about when we are going out into these environments. So this was a very whistle-stop tour overview of changes within the Alps. There is so much more to be said. It's kind of hard sometimes to know what to even say about alpine change. But what I haven't really said yet, and it's really important to remember, is that these zones don't exist by themselves. They are all part of one system. So when things are happening at the top of the mountain and we are having collapse of mountainsides, that's impacting everything below it. And if you have part of the mountain collapsing, you will of course see those impacts lower down in the valley, and those can be very human impacts. If we think about Nesthorn over the last few days and the last week, all the people who had to be evacuated, those are very human costs to change in the Alpine environment. So I have a photo here of the Stubai Tal, sort of a bit further out. You can see a bit more of the valley, and you can see more of the different zones that we've spoken about today between 1910 and 2008. And yeah, there is much more forest now than there used to be, but there is also much less glacier. And I think these sorts of images are really powerful because we have these perceptions of shifting baselines. We don't really remember how things used to be because they were so long ago in the past, and the change is so gradual over time. When we see these things either side, we realize just how much the environment has changed. So for my final slide, I wanted to reflect a little on what this means for us as people who enjoy mountain sports. I'm assuming all of you enjoy being out in the mountains. I know I definitely do. So yeah, what does this change mean for people who use the mountains for recreation? Well, we can think about increased rockfall in not just high areas, but also increasingly in lower paths as well. So we have to think about where these rocks can be coming down. Is there protection above me in case of rockfall, especially after heavy rainfall? And really paying attention to signage when it tells us this is dangerous, watch out for rockfall. We also need to think about extreme weather. So extreme heat can be really dangerous, but also lightning storms and flash flooding, and we expect all of these to be increasing in the future. So really reading more than one weather forecast, really having a very good idea of what the weather is going to be before we head out is really, really important, especially because we're expecting weather to become less predictable. We also might have to think about things like heat stroke. The classic Alpine start might have to be earlier in the morning, especially when we're thinking about heat on the glacier and the kinds of impacts that can have on your safety on a glacier as well. And of course, lots of snow and ice in glaciers means loss of snow and ice in glaciers, means shorter seasons of accessibility. At the same time, we're also seeing increases in the number of people who are out on the glaciers doing these kinds of glacier sports, but also just being out on the glacier because there is gondola access. I'm sure this is something that you have noticed, and also especially guides have noticed. And I think as we go into the future, we're also going to have to think about how do we manage this better to make sure everyone is safe. We want as much people to be out enjoying the mountains as possible, but I think climate change means everything is less predictable than it used to be. And there are lots of examples of mountains that are no longer safe for most of the public to access anymore. Yeah, so that is my final slide. I want to say thank you to my professor, Eric Tasser, for sharing these photos from his project with me, the comparison ones. And yeah, thank you all for your attention. And if you have any questions, I would do my best to answer them.
Go ahead, Ted.
Thanks, Laura. That was really interesting. I learned quite a lot about stuff I didn't know about, and it's a very worrying picture you've painted. I have one question I have is some of the changes you talked about, are they purely through climate change, or are there economic factors? I was thinking about farming, the almshouses, that's becoming less a thing. Is that also because you make more money by planting Norwegian spruce and getting wood from that land than you would from having cows and animals roaming it in the summer?
Yeah, so that is a really good point. So when I started putting this together, I was like, okay, I want this to be mostly about climate change, but the reality of climate change in the Alps is that it's really intertwined with land use management change. And it's really hard to disentangle those two. So in terms of the Alps, yes, that way of life is really, really difficult now for most people to sustain. And that is not just down to climate change. You're right, that is also down to economic factors. I think what's interesting is that these things interact with each other. So you have both the impacts of human change and climate change within the same area. And sometimes it can be hard to know what is causing one and what is causing the other. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. I mean, I guess there's a bit of a related question, but what's happening in the world with in the States, especially, where research into climate change is being defunded, which is quite worrying. Are you seeing any of that impacting your work in Austria? Are people becoming aware of perhaps the terminology they use, or and that relates a little bit to my question, because I can see people saying, oh, it's not just climate change, people want to be graphic designers and not work on the farm all day. I just wondered if that's impacting you yet. Maybe that's a question for another time, but
yeah, it feels like a dangerously political question.
I didn't mean it to be dangerous.
No. So I've not really noticed that yet. Here, I don't know how that is playing out. That's kind of probably still in kind of like the politics kind of part of the sphere. What we are noticing is that a lot of professors that used to be in the States are now applying for jobs here in Europe. A lot of the postdoc positions now advertised here, especially environmental sciences, have a lot of American applicants. So in a way, there could be kind of benefits for us over here because we get a lot of that American talent. But yeah, especially what is happening in the States at the moment is quite scary. And I think it's worth saying that climate change is really sad and scary. And I think that's a really rational response to what's happening. But it's about not letting those things intimidate you and shut you down.
Quite right. Thank you.
Yeah, Laura, since there's no hands raising up at the moment, I'll ask a question from my side. You're studying the Stubai region. The Stubai Glacier has been retreating even very obviously, even in the last 10 years that I've been looking at it. When is Stubai Glacier going to have to start changing its name? When can we expect to because if we look at the theory, what makes a glacier, it needs to be a certain size, it needs to be older than 10 years, and it needs to be moving. I'm not sure it's still moving.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I don't know an exact date for that. You'll have seen probably in the media that they are holding sometimes these funerals for the glaciers, where exactly what you said happens. The glacier becomes too small; it can no longer sustain itself. And And I saw a statistic yesterday that 99% of the glaciers in Austria have retreated, or were retreating last year. And I think by 2050, almost all of the glaciers in Austria will have lost half of their mass. When can we stop calling them glaciers? That's, yeah, a good question. And I think also it's quite a social question in a way, because we have attached this idea and vision of what a glacier is to these places. And I think what we see when we are wrapping these glaciers in plastic as well is kind of us almost clutching at straws, trying to protect them in any way we can, apart from doing, of course, the hard thing of reducing carbon emissions. Yeah, I mean, I think by 2050, the Stubai Gletscher might have to change its name to the Stubai Snowfield. But we also, the other thing about climate change is that it's highly unpredictable. And there are a lot of people out there who are very hopeful that the Gulf Stream is going to collapse and we're going to have a mini ice age, but we just don't know.
Thanks. I think Wouter has a question.
Yes, so thanks, Laura, for the interesting talk. I was wondering, did you also observe a big change in animal life and habits in the Alps?
Yeah, that is a good question. So at the same time, what Ted said earlier about what is management and what is climate change, we're seeing the return of large carnivores to the Alps in a way that we haven't seen for quite a while. The return of things like wolves and bears, and those are actually not linked to climate change. We think those are linked to management, and that these large carnivores are moving westwards from Eastern Europe. But in relation specifically to climate change, much like how the trees move uphill because the conditions are favorable, we may also see these animal species migrating up the mountain. And it's possible that we could see this kind of squishing effect happening at the top of the mountain, where essentially everything is moving up, but the habitat that was already there still is there, but everything is in a much smaller area and they're having to compete with each other. These are kinds of hypotheses at the moment. We don't really know what's going to happen yet. And I also have spoken to some land managers who say that they've noticed that the Gamsen or chamois have actually moved down into the valley, which is kind of the opposite of what we would expect. We would expect them to move up the mountain towards the cooler conditions. But yeah, things are for sure changing in terms of animals as well, though it's something I know a bit less about.
Right, then I think we're going to round off here. Laura, thank you so much for these insights. It is sadly always a wake-up call. Not sure for what, but it's always great to at least listen to people who are spending much more time looking at these issues, and I really appreciate you taking the time to tell us, and about 50 people who joined live on Instagram throughout the talk about on this topic. Thank you so much.
No, you're so welcome. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk about it.